Recovery from disasters is almost always a prolonged and socially uneven process, one promoted by different actors with different visions and motivations. The creation, circulation, reinforcement, and subversion of ideas about what recovery means, what it should entail, for who, is what we refer to as the representation of recovery. We studied the impact representation has on shaping post-disaster interventions in India, looking at what is prioritised, who benefits, and why. And we revealed how important it is to understand these processes if recovery is to be strengthened, especially of those most deeply impacted within society. We drew from 3 states in India, Odisha, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, where we undertook research relating to disaster events that have occurred in recent memory.
It's now widely recognized that the effects of environmental hazards are fundamentally shaped by societal factors, and that no disaster is truly natural. However, it's still common to hear disaster events being described in terms of irresistible forces of nature, about which little could have been done to reduce risk. Reports on the rain and floods that hit Kerala in August 2018 constructed a narrative around the unprecedented magnitude and impact of the events. Commentaries described the tempestuous ferocity of nature and the utter helplessness of humankind before that might. This portrayal ignores the role of human agency and social structures in shaping who becomes exposed to hazards and who's affected most by them, in the short and long term. It also disregards the gains that can be made in the post-disaster period to build resilience within society.
Disaster-affected people are seen as a homogeneous group of victims left at the mercy of external help. This view ignores the huge variations that exist in people's vulnerabilities and masks their agency to self-define their recovery needs to direct their own lives. Humanitarian actors, including the government, tend to see people as beneficiaries of their one-size-fits-all recovery measures, even if such provisions may not always be beneficial to all. Poor long-term outcomes of disaster-affected resettlements are well documented. Worse still are environmental losses that are rarely noticed, and in effect, the already cash-strapped communities dependent on them are left to deal with such losses in the long term. Such was the case in Ersama, where increased groundwater salinity experienced after the storm surge in 1999 was never addressed, and farmers have gravitated towards aquaculture, a highly risky new livelihood. Not only has this left women and the landless worse off, there is little support from the state for the vast majority, and the unconcern for unfolding environmental changes continues.
As in any sphere of governance, the decisions following a disaster event are not straightforward. Different actors will have differing perspectives on the way forward. In response to criticism received in the aftermath of the floods in Tamil Nadu in 2015, the government was keen to demonstrate fast, decisive action. This translated into a rapid evacuation and resettlement of thousands of poorer households from the center of Chennai, justified on the grounds that they were sites of encroachment on flood-prone land. However, since then, new infrastructure has been built on much of the land that they occupied. Many residents of these sites were relocated to the outskirts of the city. People struggled with poor provision of services, safety concerns, and accessing income and livelihood opportunities in these new settlements. In effect, the post-disaster decisions made by the government created new vulnerabilities for groups already coping with losses arising from the floods.
Memorialization takes many forms and serves varying functions. What societies remember or forget is based on a selective and unequal process, with different motivations and interests coming into play. Official versions of memorialization, like the creation of monuments or annual commemorative events, are often shaped by the moral concern to pay respect to the disaster-affected people and strengthen or repair state-society relations. However, in Odisha, few people affected by the super cyclone in 1999 placed emotional significance in the official Cyclone Memorial Day. Instead, they placed greater importance on more intimate forms of memorialization embedded in the landscape. To some, the cyclone shelter in the village or a house that withstood the surge and in which nobody died were symbolic representations of the disaster. Changing landscapes like aquaculture ponds replacing paddy fields symbolized a significant change in life post-disaster. This suggests the importance of including environment and social features in recovery processes, just as much as basic needs of shelter or work.
Research on disaster situations in different sites within Tamil Nadu reveals major geographical disparities in the depth and content of media reporting. Reporting on the 2015 South India flood heavily focused on Chennai city, the state capital. In contrast, reporting from neighbouring rural districts was minimal, revealing an urban bias. Similarly, Cyclone Gaja had a severe impact in the south of the state, but received little attention from the media. This was said to be because storms on this coast are an established threat and therefore less newsworthy than unprecedented events. There is a tendency to focus on visible impacts such as damage to infrastructure, to aggregate such as number of lives lost, and to quantify damage in monetary terms. Such reporting tools homogenize impacts and tend to mask some of the more intangible effects of disasters. This uneven representation of events affected the speed and quantity of relief aid and funding for recovery.
After disaster, different perspectives on how to recover are forefronted, and typically, ideas from more powerful actors dominate the public discourse. These dominant representations of recovery not only shape the agenda on who benefits and how, but also lead to support for more specific interventions. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, state and non-state organizations in Tamil Nadu focused on recovery interventions such as providing housing, reconstructing infrastructure like roads and bridges, and rehabilitating economic livelihoods. However, communities affected by the tsunami voiced a much broader and longer-term understanding of recovery, such as rebuilding the community's social fabric, restoring trees and salinized soil in villages, setting up schools to help realize longer-term aspirations. Importantly, recovery interventions overlooked recovery from non-tangible impacts, such as people's changed relationship with the sea, and the associated implications for livelihoods and place attachment. Thus, narratives of holistic recovery from disaster-affected communities contrasted with the programmatic approaches that were implemented after the tsunami and more recent disaster events.
Amid the urgency and politics of post-disaster action, we noticed that the needs of marginalized groups drew even less attention than they normally receive. After the 2018 floods in Kerala, the narrative of loss and recovery portrayed by the media and the state largely revolved around paddy cultivators in Kuttanad. This overshadowed the losses incurred by other occupational groups, especially the landless agricultural laborers. These vulnerabilities, interlaced with social inequality arising out of caste positions, constrained their ability to cope with and recover from the floods. Further, the much acclaimed bumper harvest, which was represented as being synonymous with the recovery of the Kuttanad region, had no impact on the recovery of the landless agricultural laborers. Government narratives didn't adequately capture these social hierarchies within the paddy sector, and there was no recognition or support for the needs of different groups.
In most situations where the dominant representation of needs is at odds with grassroots concerns, there are forms of resistance and opportunities to counter that framing. In Odisha, for instance, after Cyclone Fani in 2019, several people protested against the state for reasons such as failure to restore drinking water supply and for better housing post-disaster. Although fewer in number, disaster-affected communities and individuals have also sought litigation as a means to represent their needs, to also seek justice and have some agency in shaping their course of recovery. For example, communities contested the location of cyclone shelters and demanded course correction from the state when they were excluded from decision-making processes. In a fishing village, women who felt that their needs were disregarded self-organized to pool money towards a resilience fund that could help them recover from future crisis conditions. This suggests that in the absence of effective state-led recovery measures, communities are sometimes compelled to devise strategies themselves in an attempt to enable their recovery.
Our research underlines that after a major hazard strikes, we rarely see a truly impartial process of rehabilitation, in which relative needs are assessed and then prioritized. Instead, we see competing viewpoints and interests in a representational arena. Many of the ideas there are reactive, politicized, and contested. Representations of recovery can have profound effects on people's chances to restore their livelihoods and well-being, particularly for those whose voices become sidelined. We need to shift representations of recovery to match the needs and voices of those most affected. Indeed, some disaster-affected people already try to do this through creative arts, advocacy, litigation, and protest. Recovery interventions should take a long-term, holistic approach. They should bring more marginalized groups into the planning process, and they should be adapted to new circumstances as they unfold. And this has to continue long after the disaster event, because many impacts take time to truly surface.